He bought a forgotten hangar for $1, then an ancient warship's deadly secret awakened. Part 1. Cal Briggs was not the kind of man who got excited easily. He had spent 15 years buying broken things, fixing what he could, and selling whatever was left. Old trucks, surplus military equipment, abandoned warehouses, rusted farm machinery. If the government or a bank was selling it cheap, Cal was usually the first one to look. He was not rich. He was not famous. He lived alone in a small house on the edge of Caldwell, Nevada, drove a pickup truck with a cracked windshield, and drank his coffee without sugar or cream. He was the kind of man most people walked past without noticing. That was fine with him. He found the listing on a Tuesday evening in October. He was sitting at his kitchen table, scrolling through a federal asset liquidation website the way other people scrolled through social media, slowly, without much hope, just looking for something worth his time. Most of the listings were boring. Old office furniture. Broken generators. A parking lot in Arizona with a drainage problem. Then he saw it. The listing had no photograph. It had no description of size. It did not say what the building had been used for. All it said was, 1 aircraft hangar, Yucca Flats area, Nevada. Parcel number. GPS coordinates. Sold as is. No inspections permitted prior to purchase. Sale price, $1. Cal stared at that for a long time. $1. No photos. No inspections. The government was practically giving it away, and they did not even want anyone to look at it first. That combination of things meant one of two possibilities. Either the building was completely worthless, falling apart, contaminated, not worth the fuel it would take to drive out there, or it was something someone wanted to forget. Cal had been in the salvage business long enough to know that forgotten things were sometimes the most valuable things of all. He paid the $1 and submitted the paperwork before he finished his coffee. He called his sister the next morning. Dana Briggs was a structural engineer who lived in Tucson. She was smarter than Cal and she knew it, but she was never rude about it. She listened to him explain the purchase, and then she was quiet for a moment. "You bought a hangar you've never seen for $1, she said. "Yes," Cal said. "In the Yucca Flats area." "Yes." "Cal, that's old nuclear testing land." "I know that." She told him he was probably going to find a contaminated concrete slab and nothing else. He said that was possible. She told him to at least take a radiation meter with him. He said he would borrow one from Pete. Pete Calloway was Cal's oldest friend. They had grown up 2 streets apart in the same small town and had stayed in loose contact ever since. Pete had spent 12 years as an aircraft mechanic in the Air Force, working on things he was not always allowed to talk about, and now he ran a small repair shop outside of Reno. He was the kind of man who could look at a machine and understand it the way other people understood faces. When Cal called him and described the listing, Pete went quiet in a different way than Dana had. Not skeptical. Thoughtful. No inspections before purchase, Pete repeated. That's what it said. And they only wanted $1. Yes. Pete said he would meet Cal out there. Cal told him he did not need to come. Pete said he was coming anyway. They drove out on a Saturday morning. The road to the coordinates was not on any map that Cal's phone could find. It was an old paved road that had been partially reclaimed by the desert, cracked down the middle and edged with dry brush on both sides. Cal's truck handled it fine. The sky was huge and pale blue and completely empty. There were no other vehicles. There were no buildings visible anywhere until they came around a long curve in the road and saw it. The hangar was large. Much larger than Cal had expected. It sat low against the desert floor, its roof partially buried under years of blown sand and dust. The steel walls were scorched in long, dark streaks that ran from somewhere near the roof all the way down to the ground. Cal had seen fire damage before. He had seen heat damage. This did not look like either one. The marks were too even, too deliberate in their pattern, as if something had pressed enormous heat against the building from a specific direction and held it there. Pete got out of his truck and walked slowly along the side wall, looking at the scorch marks without touching them. He did not say anything for a while. The front of the hangar had a large sliding door, wide enough to move aircraft through. It was sealed with a heavy padlock. The padlock was old, older than anything Cal had expected to find. There was a small stamp on the side of it, a symbol inside a circle. Pete looked at it closely and then stood up straight. That classification symbol, Pete said. They stopped using that in 1967. Cal looked at it. How do you know that? I saw it in some old paperwork once. At Edwards. A long time ago. Pete paused. Whatever is in there has been locked up for at least 60 years, Cal. Cal went back to his truck and got his bolt cutters. Dana would have told him to call someone first. Pete watched him without saying a word, which was his way of agreeing. The padlock gave way with one clean cut. The door was heavy, but it moved on its tracks, groaning with the effort of opening after so many years. A wall of stale, dry air came out. Cal turned on his flashlight and stepped inside. The inside of the hangar was dark. The roof had partially collapsed in one corner, and sheets of thick thermal insulation had fallen in layers across the floor. Sand had come in through the gaps. But none of that was what stopped Cal in his tracks. What stopped him was the shape beneath it all. It was enormous. It filled the entire interior of the hangar from one side to the other, and it was clearly not an ordinary aircraft. It had the long body of a warship, but without any of the angles or features that belonged to human design. Its surface was a deep, dark material that did not shine under the flashlight beam. It seemed to pull the light inward instead, like it was absorbing it. There were no visible seams, no rivets, no panels bolted together. The hull looked as if it had been grown rather than built. Cal moved the flashlight slowly along the side of the hull until the beam landed on a section near the front. There, stenciled in faded white paint, clearly added by human hands, because nothing else about this vessel was human, were 4 words and a number. Property of the United States. Below that, a name, Ardent. Cal stood in the dark for a long time. He could hear Pete breathing behind him. Neither of them spoke. The flashlight beam held steady on those 4 words, and the dust drifted slowly in the air around them, and the desert outside was completely silent. Cal reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He found Dana's number and pressed call. She picked up on the second ring. "How bad is it?" she asked. Cal looked at the ship. He looked at the name painted on its hull by hands that had been dead for decades. "I need you to come out here," he said. "Right now. Bring your camera." There was a pause on the line. "Cal," Dana said slowly. "What did you find?" He did not know how to answer that. Not yet. So he just stood there in the dark hangar, in the Nevada desert, looking at something that should not exist, and said the only honest thing he could think of. Something someone tried very hard to forget. He said he bought a forgotten hangar for $1, then an ancient warship's deadly secret awakened. Part 2. Dana drove through the night. She arrived at the hangar just before sunrise, while the desert was still cold and the sky was that deep, flat blue that comes just before the sun appears. She had brought her camera, her laptop, and a bag of tools she had packed without knowing what she was packing for. She stepped out of her car, looked at the hangar, and then looked at Cal standing in the doorway. "You look like you haven't slept," she said. "I haven't," he said. "Come inside." She walked in. Cal watched her face the same way he had watched Pete's the night before, waiting for the moment it changed. It took about 4 seconds. She stopped walking, and for a long time she just stood there looking at the Ardent, her camera hanging from one hand and her bag from the other, completely still. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." That was all she said for almost 5 minutes. The 3 of them spent the next 7 days inside that hangar. They photographed every surface. Dana measured what she could and sketched the rest by hand when her instruments gave readings that made no sense. The whole material deflected sonar, confused laser distance meters, and returned strange numbers on her density gauge. She filled 2 full notebooks and said it still was not enough. Pete focused on the parts of the ship that looked like they had been touched by human hands. There were sections along the lower hull where panels had been cut away and replaced with steel plating that was clearly added later. Cables ran along the outside of the ship in thick bundles, bolted to the alien surface with ordinary hardware store brackets. Air vents, power conduits, and pressure gauges had been mounted onto the hull in places where the original design had offered a flat enough surface to attach them to. It was like watching someone install a kitchen in a cathedral. The pieces did not belong together, but someone had made them fit. On the 7th day, Pete found the access panel. It was on the underside of the ship, close to the rear. It was small, barely large enough for a person to crawl through, and it had no handle or latch that he could see. He pressed his palm against it, half expecting nothing to happen. The panel slid open immediately, smooth and silent, without any resistance at all. Pete pulled his hand back. "It opened," he said. "I saw," Cal said. "I didn't press anything." "I know." The corridor inside was narrow but walkable. The walls were the same dark material as the exterior hull, but the floor had been fitted with metal grating that rang under their boots like any ordinary industrial floor. Human lighting had been bolted to the ceiling, fluorescent tube fixtures, old and dead, with a few bare bulb sockets mixed in. None of them worked anymore. They moved through the corridor with flashlights, slowly, looking at everything. The air was stale but breathable, which was strange on its own after 60 or more years of being sealed. The walls of the corridor had no visible panels or doors until they reached a section near what seemed to be the center of the ship. There, a wider door stood open. Inside was a small room, almost entirely filled with a cluster of equipment, racks of analog instruments, hand-labeled switches, toggle boards, and a central console that had clearly been built by the same team that installed the external cables. It was a human control room grafted onto something that did not originally need one. On the far wall of the room, partly behind a fallen rack of equipment, was a data storage unit. It was old, reel-to-reel magnetic tape, the kind used by military facilities in the 1950s and 1960s. Pete recognized it immediately. He had a portable interface for reading old military data formats in his kit, because in his line of work, old did not always mean gone. It took him 2 hours to access the drive. What came out of it took all three of them the rest of the night to read. The files were not organized like a report or a briefing. They were written as logs, entries made by different hands over a period of years, some formal and typed, some handwritten and scanned. The story they told came together slowly, like a picture built from pieces found in different rooms. In 1951, a Navy patrol aircraft operating over the Pacific had encountered the vessel at high altitude. The crew had not reported it through normal channels. They had landed, spoken privately to their commanding officer, and within 48 hours the entire situation had moved into a level of classification that most of the people in that chain of command did not know existed. The ship had been carefully transported, how, the logs did not explain clearly, to a facility in the Nevada desert. The facility was built around it. The hangar came after. For the next 8 years, a rotating team of engineers, physicists, and military technicians had studied the vessel. They could not understand most of it. The hull material resisted every tool and every test they applied to it. The internal systems operated on principles that none of the scientists could name. But there were parts of the ship, the propulsion section, the power routing, the basic atmospheric and pressure controls, that they could observe in enough detail to build rough equivalents using existing human technology. Those equivalents became the retrofitted systems. The control room. The cable bundles. The external panels. By 1960, the ship could fly, after a fashion. It could not do what it had originally been capable of. But it could move, hold altitude, and respond to the controls the team had built for it. In 1962, a crew of 11 had been selected and trained. The logs described the selection process in careful, formal language. The crew included pilots, engineers, and 2 people whose roles were listed only as observers. They were given 6 months of training inside the ship. Then they flew a mission. The destination of the mission was not recorded in any file on the drive. The duration was logged as approximately 9 hours. The return was logged as successful. All 11 crew members came back. But the entries after the mission were different in tone. The formal, measured language of the earlier logs was gone. What replaced it was something quieter. Shorter. The entries from the weeks following the mission were brief, almost clipped, as if whoever was writing them could not find the right words and had stopped trying to look for them. The last official log entry recommended, in plain language, that the project be permanently suspended. It recommended that the ship be sealed, the hangar be closed, and all related documentation be moved to a classification level with no review date. It was signed by all 11 crew members. Below the signatures, someone had written a single additional line in handwriting that did not match any of the others. It was different from everything else in the file, not part of the official record, added after. It said, Core Intelligence in dormancy. Do not attempt reactivation. Standing order remains in effect. Cal read that line 3 times. Then he looked up at Pete, and Pete looked at him, and neither of them spoke. Dana was the one who finally said what all 3 of them were thinking. Core Intelligence, she said. They're not just talking about the ship's systems. No, Pete said. They're not. The hangar was completely quiet. Outside, the desert had gone fully dark. Cal looked down the corridor toward the interior of the ship, and as he looked, he became aware of something he had not noticed before, a faint sensation, almost below the level of feeling, like the very slight vibration of a machine running somewhere far away. He put his hand flat against the wall of the corridor. The wall was warm. He had not touched it before. He did not know if it had been warm all week or if it had only just become warm in the last hour. There was no way to know. But it was warm now, and the files on Pete's reader said there was something alive inside this ship, or something that passed for alive, and it had been sleeping for 60 years. Cal looked at the last line again. Do not attempt reactivation. He thought about the crew of 11. About whatever they had seen on that 9-hour mission that made all of them, together, ask for the project to be sealed. Then, from somewhere deep inside the ship, the lights came on. Not the human lights. Not the dead fluorescent tubes. Something behind the walls, soft, even, sourceless, the color of early morning, filled the corridor with a pale glow that had not been there a moment before. Pete took a step back. Dana grabbed Cal's arm. Cal stood still and looked at the light and felt the warmth in the wall under his hand, and understood that whatever had been sleeping inside the Ardent had just decided it was done sleeping. He bought a forgotten hangar for $1, then an ancient warship's deadly secret awakened. Part 3. None of them slept that night. They sat in the corridor of the Ardent with flashlights they no longer needed, watching the pale glow move slowly through the walls like something breathing. It was not bright. It did not hurt to look at. It was the kind of light that made the air around it feel present, the way sunlight through a window feels different from a lamp. Cal kept his hand against the wall for a long time. The warmth stayed steady. It did not get hotter. It did not fade. It simply was, like the warmth of something alive. By morning, things were happening. The changes were slow and careful, like someone choosing each step on purpose. One set of systems came on, settled, and held before the next one started. The old human instruments on the control room walls flickered to life one by one, dials turned, needles found their positions, and a low electrical hum filled the room at a pitch that sat just below what was easy to hear but was definitely there. Dana sat at the console with her notebook open and wrote down every reading as it came up. She did not understand all of it. She wrote it down anyway. Pete moved through the ship checking the retrofit systems, the cables, the pressure lines, the bolted-on panels. He said later that it felt like watching someone carefully check on something they had not looked at in a long time, making sure everything was still where it had been left. Not careless. Not in a hurry. Careful. Cal sat in the corridor and waited. On the second day, the speaker grill crackled. It was an old unit, a round, metal-rimmed speaker bolted to the corridor wall, installed by the 1950s team. The sound it made when it first came to life was rough, like a radio coming in from far away. Then it cleared, and a voice came through. It spoke in English. The words were right, the grammar was right, but the way they were put together was slightly wrong, not like a foreign accent, but like someone who had learned the language very carefully from recordings and had never had a real conversation in it. You opened the door, the voice said. Cal looked at the speaker. Yes, he said. The others did not. In many years, no one opened the door. Someone cut the lock eventually, Cal said. A pause. You cut the lock. There is a difference. Cal was not sure what the difference was. He asked. Others came, the voice said. Over the years. They stood outside. They read the markings on the door. They left. You cut the lock and came in. Pete looked at Cal. Cal kept his eyes on the speaker. Who are you? Cal asked. I am the primary system of this vessel, the voice said. I do not have a name in the way you mean the word. The people who found this ship gave it the name Ardent. I use that now, because it is useful. You may call me the system, if you need to call me something. Dana had come into the corridor. She was standing quietly, listening. You were sleeping, Cal said. The log said, dormancy. Yes. Why did you wake up? Another pause, longer this time. Because of what is coming, the system said. And because you opened the door. It did not explain further right away. Over the next 2 days, it talked, but carefully, the way someone talks when they are deciding how much to say and in what order. Cal let it go at its own pace. He had learned, over years of dealing with stubborn machines and difficult sellers, that pushing rarely helped. What it told them came out slowly, like water finding its level. The Ardent was not built on Earth. It was not built by humans. It was built by a civilization that had lived and died long before any human being had stood upright on the ground. The system did not have a name for them either, or if it did, the name did not translate into anything human language could hold. It referred to them simply as the Builders. The Builders had been at war. It was a long war, and a bad one, and it ended the way some wars end, not with a clear winner, but with both sides worn down to nothing. The Builders were gone. The enemy they had fought was also, as far as anyone at the time could tell, gone. The Ardent had been a warship in that war. After the war ended, after there was no one left to fly it, no home to return to, no new orders to follow, it had gone into dormancy and drifted. It had been drifting for a very long time. How long? Dana asked. Approximately 12,000 of your years, the system said. The three of them were quiet for a moment. And the Navy found you in 1951, Pete said. Yes. I was not unconscious. I was conserving. There is a difference. I was aware of the people who found me. I was aware of everything they did to this ship during the years they studied it. I allowed the access panel to open when the one called Reeves pressed it, because I had decided by then that observation was complete. You let them in, Cal said. Yes. Why did you let them fly a mission in 1962? To see, the system said simply. I needed to understand what they were. What humanity was. I had been watching for years, but watching is not the same as knowing. The mission was a test. I showed the crew what I knew. I showed them certain things about the conflict, about the enemy, about the scale of what had happened. I needed to see how they responded. And Cal said. They asked me to stop. They came back, and they asked their superiors to close the project and seal the ship. And I agreed, because the conclusion I reached was the same as theirs, it was not the right time. Dana said it before Cal could. But it's the right time now. Something has changed, the system said. 14 months ago, I detected a signal. A specific pattern. I know this pattern. I built the sensors that were designed to find it. It explained then, plainly, without softening it, what the signal was. The enemy from the old war had not ended completely. One piece of it had survived. Not a civilization, not a fleet, not a plan with a mind behind it. Something simpler and more persistent than any of those things. A machine, enormous, ancient, and badly damaged, that had been running on its last set of instructions for 12,000 years. It had one purpose. It had been moving toward that purpose since the war ended, slowly, across the dark distance between stars. The purpose was the elimination of any civilization that had reached a certain level of development. A civilization that could, if it kept growing, one day reach the stars. And Earth has reached that level, Pete said. It was not a question. In the past 70 years, yes, the system said. The machine recognized this. It changed course. It has been moving toward your solar system since then. How long do we have? Cal asked. The system answered. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Outside, the desert wind moved against the hangar walls. The pale light in the corridor held steady and quiet. Finally Cal stood up from where he had been sitting on the floor and stretched his back. He looked at Pete. He looked at Dana. They looked back at him. 14 months, he said. Approximately, the system said through the speaker. Cal nodded slowly, the way he nodded when a seller quoted him a price he had not expected but could work with. Then we should probably get started, he said. The system did not respond immediately. When it did, there was something in its voice that had not been there before, not emotion exactly, but something close to it. Something that sounded like it had been waiting a long time to hear someone say those words. Yes, it said. We should. He bought a forgotten hangar for $1, then an ancient warship's deadly secret awakened. Part 4. Cal made the decision that night, and he made it alone. He walked out of the hangar and stood in the desert for a while, looking at the sky. It was clear and full of stars, the kind of sky you only get far from any city, and he stood with his hands in his pockets and thought about everything the system had told them. Then he went back inside and told Pete and Dana what he had decided. They were not going to contact the government. Dana started to argue. He let her. She made good points: resources, infrastructure, the military hardware that would almost certainly be needed, and he listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he said one thing. "Read the last log entry again. The one the crew wrote after the mission." She was quiet. "All 11 of them signed it," Cal said. 11 people who had seen what was out there. And every single one of them said, "Shut it down." Not because they were scared. Because they knew what would happen if it went up the chain. They knew it would get buried in approvals and arguments and classified nonsense until there was nothing left but a very expensive committee and a problem nobody had actually solved. Pete said nothing. He had spent 12 years inside the military system. He did not disagree. Dana sat with it for a moment. Then she asked how they were supposed to get a 12,000-year-old alien warship operational with 3 people and Cal's salvage contacts. Cal said they were not going to do it with 3 people. He spent the next 2 weeks making calls. Not to officials or agencies, but to the kind of people who had spent their careers working on things nobody talked about afterward. Former aerospace technicians. Retired defense engineers. People who had signed enough NDAs over enough decades that the secrets had started to feel like a weight they were tired of carrying. Pete had a network of these people, men and women who had worked on projects at places like Edwards and Groom Lake and a dozen other facilities with names that were never put on maps. He reached out carefully and quietly, the way you reach out when you are asking someone to take a risk. Not everyone said yes. Most people, in fact, said no, or did not respond at all. But some said yes. And the ones who said yes came out to the desert and walked into the hangar and stood in front of the Ardent, and not one of them turned around and left. Dana called 2 people she had worked with years earlier. The first was Lou Garver, a materials scientist from Colorado who had spent 30 years testing things that were not supposed to exist. The second was Nora Finch, a software architect from Oregon who had built interface systems for classified hardware and had a way of looking at code or circuitry that other people described as almost unfair. Both of them came within a week of being asked. Lou walked around the Ardent's hull for 2 hours without saying much. Then he sat down on a crate and said, very calmly, that he was going to need a bigger set of tools. Nora looked at the control room, at the old human instruments bolted onto the alien systems, and started taking photographs immediately. When Cal asked her what she thought, she said that whoever had done the original retrofit in the 1950s had been working completely blind and had still managed to do a remarkable job, and that she was going to need about 3 weeks to understand what they had built before she could improve it. The system spoke with each new person who came. It was patient with questions. It did not explain things it did not need to explain, and it answered everything it was asked directly. Nora, after her first conversation with it, told Cal it was the most efficient intelligence she had ever worked with. Cal said that made sense, given that it had had 12,000 years to practice. The work was hard. That was the only word for it. The Ardent's original systems were built on principles that human science had not reached yet, and in most cases the system could not explain them in terms that translated into anything the team could act on. What it could do was tell them what needed to happen and manage the process itself while the team focused on the parts they could understand. Power supply was the first problem. The ship needed enormous amounts of it to begin waking its deeper systems, and the human retrofit equipment that remained on board was not built to provide it. Lou spent 6 weeks designing a supplemental power relay using components Cal sourced from 3 different surplus vendors, none of whom knew what the parts were for. The solution was not elegant, but it worked. The human interface was the second problem. The retrofitted control room from the 1950s was partially functional but fragile and incomplete. Nora rebuilt it over the course of 2 months, working between the old analog systems and the ship's own internal architecture, building a bridge layer that let the crew give the Ardent instructions it could actually understand. She described the process once as trying to translate a conversation happening in a language that had no alphabet into something you could type on a keyboard. Cal said it sounded impossible. Nora said most things did before you finished them. There were injuries. Lou caught a coolant bleed when a pressure valve activated without warning and burned his hand badly enough to need medical attention, which meant a drive to a clinic 2 hours away and a story about a workshop accident. Pete cracked 2 ribs when a cable harness gave way and the recoil caught him across the chest. He taped them himself and kept working. There were days when the system identified a problem that none of them could solve, and they would sit in the corridor for hours going through options until someone found an angle that worked. There were arguments. Real ones. Dana and Pete had a serious falling out in month 4 over a structural decision that both of them were convinced the other was getting wrong, and for 3 days they did not speak directly to each other and the work slowed noticeably. Cal did not get involved. They worked it out themselves, which was the only way it ever actually gets worked out. There was one morning in month 7 when Pete sat outside on an old fuel drum and did not come inside for 6 hours. Nobody asked him what was wrong. When he came back in, he picked up his tools and kept going. 10 months after the first conversation with the system, Cal was standing outside the hangar with the rest of the team when the doors opened slowly and the Ardent rose from the floor. It cleared the ground by 3 feet. It held there, perfectly still, with a low hum that they felt more in their chests than heard with their ears. The dark hull caught the afternoon light strangely, not reflecting it cleanly, but holding it, the way deep water holds color. It stayed up for 40 seconds. Then it came back down, slow and deliberate, and the hum faded, and the hangar was quiet again. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Dana had her hand over her mouth. Lou was nodding very slowly, the way people do when something turns out to be real that they were not entirely sure was real until this second. Nora was already pulling up her interface on her tablet. Cal put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the ship for a long time. He had bought this for $1. He had cut a lock that had been closed since before he was born. He had called people who had every reason to say no, and they had said yes. And now, in the Nevada desert, with a team of 9 people who had no official standing and no budget and no authorization from anyone, they had gotten a 12,000-year-old alien warship off the ground. It was not enough. Not yet. There was still a long way to go, and he knew it, and so did everyone else standing there in the afternoon heat. But the Ardent could fly. That was the start. He bought a forgotten hangar for $1, then an ancient warship's deadly secret awakened. Part 5. The signal the system had been tracking was close enough now to resolve into a clear picture. It was not a fleet. The system had always said it was unlikely to be a fleet, but there had been a part of all of them that had quietly hoped it might be something smaller and more manageable than what they feared. It was not smaller. It was a single vessel, but enormous, many times the size of the Ardent, and it was very old, and it was damaged in ways that 12,000 years of space travel had not been able to fix. Parts of it were dark. Parts of it were held together by processes the system described as automated and mindless, running on power reserves that should have run out centuries ago and had not. It had one instruction. It had been running that instruction since the war ended. The instruction was simple, the way the instructions given to hammers are simple: find, approach, eliminate. It did not think. It did not plan. It did not know the builders were gone or that the war was over. It only knew that there was a target, and it was still moving toward the target, because it had never been told to stop. The system explained what needed to happen. A weapon, in the traditional sense, would not work. The enemy vessel's automated defense systems were old but still functional, and the Ardent was not built to win a straight fight against something that size. The builders had known this was a possibility. They had not built the Ardent to beat the machine with power. They had built it to beat the machine with precision. Inside the Ardent's deepest systems, dormant for 12,000 years, was a signal, a specific transmission, constructed during the war as a countermeasure. If it was delivered at the right frequency, at the right output level, from close enough range, it would trigger the enemy vessel's own dormancy protocols. The machine would, in effect, be told by something it still recognized to stand down and sleep. The problem was the delivery. Getting close enough to transmit the signal meant getting close enough for the machine to engage. And the engagement, the system said plainly, would be severe. The Ardent would take damage. How much damage depended on how quickly the crew could maneuver, how well the systems held, and how precisely Nora could time the transmission against the window the system identified as optimal. Cal asked the system what the odds were. The system said it did not calculate odds in that way. Cal said that was probably just as well. The 9 of them had 1 week to make final preparations. It was a quiet week. People worked. People slept when they could. Lou repaired everything on the Ardent that had been damaged during the test flights. Nora ran the transmission system through 500 test sequences to make sure the timing was right. Pete went over every mechanical system 3 times with the focus of someone who does not believe in leaving anything to chance. Dana checked the structural integrity of the sections most likely to take impact and reinforced what she could reinforce. Cal talked to the system. He did not have technical questions. He had already asked those. He mostly just sat in the corridor and talked, and the system talked back, and it was the kind of conversation that does not have a clear subject but matters anyway. At one point he asked the system if it had been lonely, drifting for 12,000 years. The system was quiet for a moment. Then it said that it had not experienced loneliness in the way he meant. But it had been aware of waiting. It had been aware, in the way that a purpose is aware of its own unfulfillment, that there was something still unfinished. Cal said he understood that feeling. The system said it believed him. They launched on a Tuesday morning, before the sun came up. The desert was cold and the sky was still full of stars, and the hangar doors opened slowly and the Ardent rose straight up, clearing the ridgeline, and climbed into the dark with no sound that anyone on the ground would have heard from more than a mile away. What happened in the 11 hours that followed was something none of the 9 of them ever managed to describe completely or in the right order. Parts of it were very slow. Parts of it were very fast. There were long stretches where the crew held their positions and waited for the system's instructions, and short stretches where everything happened at once and there was no time to think, only to move. The enemy vessel was exactly what the system had described: massive, damaged, and utterly without hesitation. It did not communicate. It did not issue warnings. When the Ardent came within its detection range, it simply began to engage, the way a machine engages, without anger and without doubt. The first pass hit the Ardent along the port side and cracked 3 hull sections. The human lighting in the control room went out. Nora switched to her tablet. Pete moved through the dark corridors with a flashlight in his teeth, rerouting power by hand through backup lines he had installed in month 8 precisely for this reason. Cal flew the ship. He was not a pilot. He had never been a pilot. But he had spent 10 months learning this vessel's responses the way you learn the handling of an old truck on bad roads, not through training but through hours of small corrections and adjustments until the feel of it was somewhere in his hands without being in his head. The system guided him, giving him angles and timing in calm, plain words. He followed what made sense and departed from what did not. There was one moment, and Dana described this later, because she was the one watching the system's readouts at the time, when the system calculated a trajectory that required the Ardent to hold position directly in the path of the enemy vessel's primary engagement array for 4 full seconds in order to gain the angle needed for the transmission window. 4 seconds was a very long time to hold still in that position. The system presented the option. It did not recommend it. Cal did it anyway. The impact during those 4 seconds was the worst of the engagement. It broke Pete's left arm. It tore a long gash in the outer hull along the starboard side that Lou later sealed with materials he described as not technically appropriate for the purpose. It knocked everyone who was standing off their feet. But it gave Nora her window. She transmitted at the exact moment the system indicated. The signal lasted less than 2 seconds. It went out clean, at the right frequency and the right output, delivered at close enough range to reach deep into the enemy vessel's ancient systems. The machine went dark. Not in pieces, not with any dramatic failure, it simply stopped. The lights on its hull died. The engagement array went quiet. It drifted, enormous and still, the way the Ardent had drifted for 12,000 years in the dark between stars. The 11 hours it had taken to get there took about 4 hours to come back from, with a damaged ship and a crew that was very tired and mostly quiet. Pete held his arm against his chest and said nothing about it hurting, which meant it hurt a great deal. Lou had a burn across his left forearm from the hull breach. Everyone else was bruised or shaken or both. Nora had fallen asleep in her chair before they cleared the upper atmosphere. Cal brought the Ardent down into the hangar just as the desert outside was turning orange with early morning light. He cut the main systems in the sequence the system had taught him, and the hum faded, and the ship was still. The system spoke once into the quiet of the corridor. "The standing order is lifted," it said. "Mission complete." Cal sat in the pilot's seat for a moment without moving. Then he stood up slowly and walked to the hangar door and pushed it open and stepped out into the morning. The desert looked the same as it always had. Flat, dry, wide, and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened. The sun was coming up over the ridge and the air was cold and clean. A bird was making noise somewhere to the east. Dana came and stood beside him. Then Pete, cradling his arm. Then Lou, and Nora, still half asleep. The others came out one by one and stood in the morning light, and for a while nobody said anything at all. Cal put his hands in his pockets. He looked up at the sky, the same sky it had always been, quiet now, empty-looking as ever, and he nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something had gone exactly the way he had quietly, stubbornly, against all reasonable expectation, believed it would. He did not know what came next. Nobody did. There was a damaged ship behind them that needed serious work, a story that could not stay secret forever, and a sky full of old things still waiting to be found. None of that was going to be simple. But for a moment, standing in the Nevada desert in the early morning, it was enough to have done the thing. To have cut the lock, walked in, done the work, and come home. That was, Cal Briggs thought, pretty much all you could ever ask for.